Today I'm going to be talking about the Iran-Iraq War. First, I'm going to delve into the causes of the war. Before all that, I'm going to give you some background information. The Iranian Revolution of 1978 and 1979 resulted in the toppling of the monarchy under Mohammad Pahlavi. It led to the establishment of the Islamic Republic under Khomeini. Mohammad Pahlavi implemented a rapid westernization process in a traditional and religious society. The power was limited to the monarchy, meaning that all power went to Mohammad Pahlavi. This was a result of Operation Ajax, which was a coup d'etat that happened in the 1950s. This overthrew the democratically elected president Mohammad Mossadegh and replaced him with Mohammad Pahlavi. The British had many reasons to overthrow Mossadegh. The oil was not flowing from Iran, and they had a strong dislike of Mossadegh. The communists in Iran also thought that Mossadegh was too close to the West and Western ideologies. Now back to why Mohammad Pahlavi was overthrown. Mohammad Pahlavi had a deep respect for the West, which brought him to power in the first place, and he wanted to modernize and secularize Iran, which in return didn't sit well with the religious part of the population. While initially he had some support from the clergy, gradually through the measures that he implemented, he managed to alienate them and turn them against him. His rule gradually shifted towards autocracy, and he banned the communist Tudeh Party of Iran and cracked down on any opposition to his rule. Now, to long-term and short-term causes. The war lasted from 1980 to 1988. The Middle East has had a long history of conflict. Iran saw regime changes before the war. Iran had a pro-Western government for decades, and radical factions in Iran were not satisfied with this decision. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution began and overthrew the government and began a new Islamic regime. Tensions between Iran and Iraq grew rapidly when the new leader of Iran, Khomeini, declared that the Ba'ath Party, also known as the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, had to be overthrown. Iraq then invaded Iran on September 22, 1980, which triggered an 8-year war that devastated both countries. Saddam Hussein said the reason for invading was a territorial dispute over Shatt el-Arab, the waterway that borders both countries. Despite this, it is commonly known that the war was triggered by regional rivalry. Hussein felt threatened by the Islamic Revolution, which brought Khomeini to power, and Khomeini saw Hussein as a brutal Sunni tyrant that would do anything to suppress the Shia majority. Saddam Hussein wanted to overthrow Khomeini because the regime could overthrow him, and because Iran was getting weaker. Saddam Hussein saw this as the perfect opportunity. One of the short-term causes was when the animosity between Sunnis and Shiites became apparent and manifested itself as an excuse for hostility and violence. This can be found in a series of purges in southern Iraq by Saddam Hussein. The Ba'ath Party rounded up Shiites in the area and those of Iranian nationality, and those who could not legally prove their Iraqi citizenship were sent back to Iran. This tightened Khomeini's grip on power. Now, continuing on, Saddam Hussein had big plans for Khomeini when he was first announced as the new leader of Iran. Hussein thought that he would be able to expand his country's power, prestige, and influence. He wanted to be the leading nation of the Middle East. One way of accomplishing many of his goals was to attack Iran. He wanted to do this because he wanted new oil fields. He wanted more land and power, and most of all, create a devastating blow to the Iranian regime. Leading up to the attack, Saddam Hussein began strengthening his forces. Iraq had over 200,000 soldiers, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of military aircrafts. On contrast, the Iranian army had just gone through severe officer purges and executions, but they still had a strong air force. On September 1980, Iraq launched an attack on Iran and the war began. Now, the war has started. On September 1980, Iraq began a massive invasion of Iran along its southwestern border. Due to mountains, much of the attack was done by airstrikes. Iran then began launching air assaults against Iraq, mostly in Baghdad, Iraq's capital. The next day, Iraq launched a ground invasion in 3 consecutive attacks. Hussein wanted to dull Khomeini's movement and wanted to rule completely over Iran. Hussein hoped that annexing Khuzestan, one of the 31 provinces of Iran which borders Iraq, would cause the downfall and end Iran's call for Hussein's overthrow. This war was quickly being seen as a guerrilla war, meaning that they were mostly comprised of volunteers and not trained soldiers. This was very true for Iran, as they had an abundance of child soldiers, most of them under the age of 16. I will talk more about this later. And a lot of the weapons used during the war were nuclear weapons, tanks, machine guns, bayonet charges, and the human wave attack. The human wave attack was mostly used by Iran. Because Iran suffered a huge shortage of heavy weapons but had devoted volunteer troops, they started using the human wave attack against the Iraqi. A human wave attack is an infantry tactic which uses unprotected frontal assault with densely concentrated troops. Now, on to U.S. involvement. The U.S. involvement in the war is very complicated. The official U.S. position was neutral. So, at the time, the United States' main concern was the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. When the Iraqi Communist Party began calling for the end of the war in 1981, the Americans saw this as a sign of them stopping the flow of communism in the country, in Iraq. So, in response, the United States restored diplomatic relations with Iraq and supplied weapons to Iraq. Iranians and Iraqis alike believed that the U.S. greenlighted the invasion of Iran. During the war, Iraq also received large quantities of weapons and other material useful to the development of armaments and weapons of mass destruction. This was primarily provided by the Soviet Union, France, China, Egypt, and Germany. The United States also sold Iraq over $200 million worth of helicopters. They also supported Saddam Hussein and wanted Iraq to win the war. The First Battle of Khorramshahr was the first major battle that took place between September 10, 1980 and November 10, 1980. This battle was known for its brutality and violence. On September 22nd, Iraq launched airstrikes throughout the country, therefore launching the first phase of this invasion. Over 150 Iraqi artillery batteries fired the opening salvo. By night, the city was a cloud of smoke and fire. Citizens of the city lacked basic needs like electricity and running water, and thousands were being executed. In response to the heavy loss, the Iraqis recuperated on the outskirts of the city until their next attack on October 11th. The city became a ghost town as a result of the battle. Iraqi soldiers also raped Iranian women in the city, and the city was left in ruins as a result of Hussein's soldiers. Now, on to the liberation of Khorramshahr. The Iranian capture of the port city of Khorramshahr happened on May 24, 1982, so 2 years after the First Battle of Khorramshahr. This is perceived as a turning point in the war, and the liberation is celebrated every May 24th. The city remained in the Iraqis' hands until the Iranians launched Operation Bait el-Maqdis to recapture the province. The first attack used over 70,000 Iranian troops and succeeded in pushing the Iraqis out of the area while also sustaining casualties. The Iraqis were determined to fight back, but unsuccessfully launched a counterattack against the Iranians who stood their ground. Saddam Hussein was shocked and furious that the Iranians had won and executed top generals in the Iraqi army. Now, a little bit more on Iranian child soldiers. Iran retaliated against Iraq unconventionally using child soldiers. While the minimum fighting age was 16, it was not uncommon to see younger. Estimated death tolls of children are over 100,000. Recruiting children under the age of 15 is a war crime, and the Iranian parliament has yet to ratify the protocol requiring the minimum age set to be 18. Okay, moving on to the ceasefire proposal. On June 20, 1982, Saddam Hussein proposed an immediate ceasefire and withdrawal from Iranian territory within 2 weeks. Khomeini responded and said that the war would not end until there was a new government in Iraq and all damages were paid. He said that Iran would invade Iraq if the Ba'ath regime was not replaced with the Islamic Republic. Iran also hoped that their attacks would ignite a revolt against Saddam's rule by the Shia and Kurdish population of Iraq and trigger Hussein's downfall. At a cabinet meeting discussing the ceasefire, the Minister of Health, Riyad Ibrahim Hussein, suggested that Saddam step down temporarily and then come back to power later. When no one agreed with the idea, Saddam brought him into another room and shot him with a pistol. He then swiftly came back to the meeting and went through it as if nothing had happened. The War of the Cities was a series of air raids that happened between 1984 and 1987. Iraq's Air Force began strategically bombing Iranian cities. This was the first systematic strategic bombing that Iraq carried out. With the help of the Soviet Union and the US, Iraq's Air Force rebuilt and expanded. By early 1984, Saddam Hussein ordered his Air Force to attack 11 Iranian cities. He wanted to bring Iran to its knees and hoped they would surrender. On contrast, Iran quickly recovered and Iraq's Air Force suffered heavy damages. Iran struck back, hitting Baghdad. Saddam Hussein also ordered chemical attacks on civilians in Iran. The attacks from Iraq and Iran resulted in tens of thousands of casualties. Over 1,200 civilians were killed in the first month alone. Now, on to the end of the war, also known as the Iraqi Offensive and the UN ceasefire. By 1988, Iran had massive weapon imports but little Iranian volunteers. Iraq planned to launch a major offensive against Iran. By February 1988, Saddam Hussein began the final and most violent offensive. Over the next 2 months, Hussein launched over 200 missiles directed at 37 Iranian cities, and also threatened to use chemical weapons. Iran retaliated and launched 104 missiles to protect the cities, but were unsuccessful due to the low number of missiles. The same day as Iraq's attack on a peninsula in Iran in April 1988, the U.S. Navy launched Operation Praying Mantis against Iran for damaging their warship. Iran lost oil platforms, destroyers, and frigates. This only stopped when President Ronald Reagan declared that the Iranian Navy had been put through enough. Saddam Hussein sent a warning to Khomeini mid-1988, threatening to launch a full-scale invasion and attack Iran using weapons of mass destruction. Soon after, Iraq bombed Iran with poisonous gas and killed over 2,000 civilians. Iran realized that the international community would not restrain Iraq, and over a third of the population in Iran had evacuated due to fear of another chemical attack. On July 20th, 1988, Iran accepted a ceasefire. Since the ceasefire would not be effective until August 20th, 1988, the Iranians wanted their last chance at retaliation against the Iraqis. They decided to go with Operation Mersad, which was the last big military operation of the war. After seeing multiple Iraqi victories in the previous years, MEK, which was a major Iranian military organization, Iran decided to launch an attack of its own. Shortly after Iran accepted the ceasefire, the operation began. It is estimated that 4,500 MEK members were killed and over 400 Iranian soldiers died. By September 1988, 50,000 to 100,000 Kurdish civilians were killed. The war finally ended on August 20th, 1988, but the economic and political effects were immense. Over 500,000 people died, some estimated to be over 15 million. Neither side achieved war aims. Hussein was not overthrown, neither was Khomeini. Iraq's economic situation as a result of the war was one of the main reasons why Hussein decided to invade Kuwait, which was when Saddam Hussein accused Kuwait of stealing their petroleum, and Western powers opposed him as a result. For Iran, the war not only resulted in material and human cost, but there was no more enthusiasm left for the Islamic Revolution. The Iran-Iraq War was the most violent and the longest war of the century. As a result, the millions now displaced from their homes are now desperately seeking asylum in Europe. The war left a slightly more positive note for the women of Iraq. Before the war, Saddam Hussein influenced the lives of Iraqi women through his actions and policies. The Iran-Iraq War compelled women to leave their kitchens to take jobs in the public arena left vacant by the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi men who went off to war. The wars also propelled many Iraqi women into the public sector workforce. Approximately 70% of women living in Baghdad were working in industries such as banking, airlines, and even in the government. By 1985, women made up approximately 30% of Iraq's workforce in the public sector. I'm going to be analyzing the point of view from a former CIA member and a current professor at the Harvard Kennedy School for Science and International Affairs. The former CIA member says Iraq's intelligence collection capabilities and analysis certainly fed into Saddam Hussein's worldview for achieving his strategic goal, but it was poorly aligned to achieve his aims. At the start of the war, Iraq's General Military Intelligence Division had only 3 officers gathering military intelligence on Iran, leaving the Iraqis knowing almost nothing about Iran's military potential outside of the fact that it had a large population and was equipped with Western weapons. Moreover, what human intelligence the GMID, or the General Military Intelligence Division, and Iraq's other services had came mostly from disgruntled Iranian officers fleeing from the new Islamic Republic and spinning stories of a rapidly weakening Iranian military. While the professor says, in invading Iran, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein assumed that the divided Iranians and their dilapidated armed forces would be unable to put up much of a fight. He was wrong. Iranians responded to the invasion by uniting against him and under their current leadership, even though many opposed the direction the revolution had taken. Iran's leaders quickly resurrected the armed forces by halting military trials and purges and enforcing conscription. So, the large difference between the two is that the CIA member mostly criticizes the Iraq's intelligence committee in the failure for the war and basically not getting good sources before the war so they could prepare a lot more and succeed, while the professor says that Saddam Hussein completely underestimated Iran because he was so confident in that Iraq would win. So these are two contrasting opinions in that one blames Iraq's intelligence committee and one blames Saddam Hussein's overconfidence in Iraq's military. And I will also introduce a women's point of view. So economically, women have gone from being visibly active in the Iraqi workforce in the 1980s to being nearly non-existent in 2013. So the women who could afford it withdrew from the public space due to the violence dominating the streets. So this was in the 1980s when the war was going on and when the war ended. So violence against women was becoming more and more prominent. 10 years ago, Iraq produced much of its own food and had a productive industrial sector, but now Iraq imports practically all of its food, and farmers and factory workers simply found themselves out of a job. So women mostly worked as farmers and factory workers. So a lot of women were out of jobs, and a lot of women who worked in government and in other jobs were being pushed out because of the violence. So while both women and men suffered as a result, the impact on women was greater due to their limited mobility in the face of poor security. So violence against women and the lack of legal protection for women is also on the rise and is still currently on the rise. So women in Middle Eastern countries like Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia still have limited rights, and their rights are still not as protected as Western countries. So this is a large difference from what I had explained earlier in the presentation, in that Iranian women or Iraqi women had felt that they were more empowered as a result of the war. But now that we're in the 2000s, women are being discriminated against and men are attacking them in their workplace, so they can't even have a proper job. So this is a severe change in how we view women.